Howdy, Larkin Rose here. Time for the Daily Rant. Today I'm going to beat up on objectivists. For those who don't know, objectivism was the philosophy made up by AYN RAND. And she's one of those people that I find it so frustrating that she didn't end up being an anarchist, because she totally said everything you need to know to totally realize that government can't possibly be legitimate. And yet she still clung to that little trace of authoritarian indoctrination. Now, given that she grew up in the Soviet Union and was just, indoctrinated into that collectivist mindset, I'm pretty freaking impressed by how far she got and how much she understood of the nature of government and authority and self-ownership and all those concepts. She didn't call it self-ownership, but and she wrote Atlas Shrugged, which is brilliant, gigantic book, and not the most thrilling story, but the content of it was just genius, and a bunch of other things like The Fountainhead and whatever else, The Virtue of Selfishness. And so most of the things she says I totally agree with, and I think she easily understood enough and argued enough to completely rule out government, but she couldn't give up the belief in her own head. And there's still a bunch of people who are sort of adherents to objectivism and treat Ayn Rand like infallible word of God. And the biggest problem, the gigantic wrench that she left lying in what would have been the machinery of freedom, was the idea that, well, we need government to have a monopoly on the defensive and retaliatory use of force. You can't have a market in protection and defense and investigating crimes and prosecuting people and punishing people. You have to have one centralized monopoly to do that, which she just insisted, and she would vehemently argue against anarchists and who said otherwise, and in the process vehemently argued against herself. And the obvious argument against that is that, wait a minute, you agree that force is only justified when used defensively. I mean, it's one of the basic concepts of objectivism and anarchism and, the whole non-aggression principle thing. So she agrees with that, and the obvious question is, wait a minute, okay, so you have your centralized monopoly government thing giving protection services. What if I want to make a competing company that does exactly what yours does, but it does it for a lower price, and we're faster and nicer and more polite, and people like us better? Then what happens? Does your monopoly centralized government have the right to forcibly shut us down for doing exactly what it's doing? Because that's not defensive. Suddenly you're the aggressor, you're the attacker, you're the bad guy by your own standards and your own principles. And she never really had a decent response to that, because there isn't a decent response to that. Because to say this, there's this service and this one company is the only one that's allowed to do it. And the excuses are, and I was just pointed to an article by an objectivist trying to make this make sense, and I've discussed it with a zillion different objectivists over the last 2 decades. And they just cling to this, and it's so weird because there's so much about principles and rationality and making things make sense, but on this they just can't let go of it. And I know a number of objectivists who did give that up and turned into anarchists, but so many of them just cling to it and just, no, there has to be the proper objective rules of how things should be have to be enforced by one government. And all it does is protect rights, but for some reason it has a monopoly, which necessarily means it shuts down any competition by force, which is instantly a contradiction. So, well, what happened to it? It only protects rights. Now it's attacking other people for doing exactly what it does, which is a ruling class, a coercive, parasitical ruling class. So this person tried to make the argument, and this is so telling of the statist mindset and the fact that you still even have this delusion stuck in the heads of people who understand so many other parts about freedom and self-ownership and non-aggression principle, but there's this one thing they just can't shake out of their head, and it's like a philosophical security blanket that they're scared to all the way acknowledge what the world is. Because they say, all right, there's these objective rules of how things should be, and there's only this one set. It's not, every opinion is not equally valid, which is true. And in order to not have 100 competing ideas of what should be enforced, everything from communism to whatever, we have to have the government, the final decider, the authority enforcing these objective rules, and nobody else is allowed to. And a few obvious questions come up. The first being, how the hell do you think that a government is going to end up exactly agreeing with your definition of what the objective rule should be, or with Ayn Rand's idea of what the objective rule should be? Second, why would you imagine that that is automatically right on everything? And it really is, it boils down to Ayn Rand didn't want to give up the idea of an external authority, even though she kind of wanted to be it. Because she figured these things out and she described them and she created objectivism and said, here are the rules and here's how things should be. And now this should be forced on everybody else because this is totally right and everybody else is totally wrong. And even if that's true, even if somebody totally understands something and gets everything right, the hypocrisy of saying, well, I'm right, so I get to force it on you. And you're wrong, so you don't get to force your opinions on me. Like, really? You don't notice a little contradiction in there? A little hypocrisy that, wait a minute, you're right because you declare you are? Because guess what? The communists declare that they're right. And the fascists declare that they're right. And everything in between declares that they're right. But you can see in this article, I don't have it in front of me right now. I skimmed over it because I've heard the argument a million times. But the argument is, well, we can't have 100 different people competing and deciding what force they think is justified because they might enforce any arbitrary weird rules you can imagine. We have to have the right rules enforced by government. First of all, why you would ever expect that is beyond me, since the government has never been anywhere near doing that. But second of all, it still implies that there will be, even if it's just an abstraction, that there is this ultimate decider thing, this magic formula that makes it so people don't have to decide things anymore. We won't need actual human beings arguing over what's right and wrong because now we have the God of Ayn Rand and the gospel according to her. And that will be the thing we all defer to and don't question and don't disagree with. And it will be enforced by a centralized government. And nobody else is allowed to compete because other people will be wrong. And it's so funny because it's so elitist and authoritarian and delusional. And for that to have remained part of what Ayn Rand preached, it's just weird that she couldn't give up that last little piece. And one of the biggest objections is, once again, it's just a complaint against reality. Just when people say, well, if not for this, you'll have everyone deciding for himself what's right and wrong. That is a description of reality. There is no way around that. Everyone does decide for himself what he thinks is right and wrong. Doesn't mean everybody's opinion is equally valid. But of course everybody does that. There can't be a situation in which they don't. So, and somebody else just argued this somewhere else, that, well, everyone's, I'm scared that this is going to give the impression that everyone decides for himself what's right and wrong. Everyone does. And it doesn't mean, that right and wrong alter from person to person, but of course their opinions do. And what's the alternative? Like, I want to make a world in which nobody else has their own opinion of right and wrong. I can just take my worldview and my values and my beliefs and smash them into everybody else's heads and everybody will agree with me. That's essentially what Ayn Rand was going for and what she wanted her centralized monopoly government to do. I know what's right. I have everything figured out. And so my codes and my values should be forced on everyone, and nobody else gets to compete. There doesn't get to be a competing defense agency. And so they were saying things like, well, what if some other defense, a common objection of objectivists is, well, what if there are two competing protection agencies and they disagree about what's right and they get into a shootout? First of all, like, that doesn't happen with government. You've never heard of war? Only when governments get into a shootout, millions of people die. Second of all, it ignores the nature of reality, and then it ignores cause and effect. The nature of reality is people will disagree. And if two people have irreconcilable differences, the idea that there's any system you can make which will make both of them happy is just silly. Obviously, one of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. If there's two people who are willing to resort to force over some disagreement, one of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. And nothing in the world makes that not true. Whether it's a dictatorship or an anarchist society, if there are two competing interests and only one can prevail, like two people both say, hey, that's my chair, and they even if they both rightfully think it's their chair, they're not going to both end up with the chair. That doesn't freaking work. And if they're both willing to resort to force because they're both so convinced that it's their chair, it's going to be resolved by force. Whether it's two people, having a forcible conflict, or you bring in a government and a court system and a world war to fight over a chair, either way, it's not going to be resolved in a way that makes both sides happy. And it's going to be resolved by force if both sides are willing to use force to try to get what they think is rightfully theirs. It's just a statement about reality. I'm not happy about it or sad about it. That's just how things are. And so to think that, well, we'll have these centralized rules and then everybody will get along and everybody will agree because you're not allowed to not agree with it. It's just sort of like, well, now we have to have one big powerful thing, but it'll be the good guy. You don't have to worry because the big powerful thing that nobody can resist, it'll be the good guy. So righteousness will always win because it's the good guy. Well, duh, not everyone else is going to think it's the good guy. And so from their perspective, you're going to make a really big, powerful bad guy. And this is, this is given the ridiculous possibility that it actually enforces the proper rules from that one person's perspective. Like that there would ever be a government that actually did what Ayn Rand wanted it to do. And that for some reason, all of the politicians, all of the financial influences, all of the dynamics of a real world wouldn't make it change one bit. That it would actually do exactly what Ayn Rand wanted it to do, down to the smallest detail. And just whenever there's a dispute over property or what constitutes fraud, when you're talking about advertising or, 8 million little questions where there will be different opinions on different sides, even if there was a government that would enforce exactly what Ayn Rand would have thought on every single point, which never in a billion years would ever happen, she isn't going to be right on everything. And I'm not ever going to be right on everything. And that's the thing of growing up and letting go of the illusion of control. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things about becoming an anarchist is realizing, wow, I don't get to control the whole world. I don't get to tell them all what to think. I don't get to tell them all what to do. And lots of people are going to do things I disagree with. And not only can't I have the power to stop it, I shouldn't have the power to stop it. I shouldn't have the power to force my values and my opinions on everybody else. And because the only way to do that is for me to be this tyrannical, evil bastard. And the chaos that comes from acknowledging that everybody does decide for himself what's right and wrong. And there's a whole lot of overlap. Vast majority of people get that, yeah, running around murdering people, that's bad. Okay, good. Almost all of us agree that running around murdering people is bad. Good. So that won't be a problem. And if one guy goes berserk and runs around murdering people, almost all of us would agree, yeah, we're allowed to stop him by force, because what he's doing is not okay. But there will always be gray areas, and the idea that you can do away with gray areas by creating an all-powerful final decider is just fascist and loony. Like, and for Ayn Rand to basically argue that is just so bizarre, because she was all about rationality and argument and logic and reason and having principles, underlying principles and values upon which a whole philosophy is based. And then to say what we have to do is do away with disagreement by having a centralized authoritarian government. It's just so weird. Never mind that on a practical level it would totally turn into tyranny again. But just conceptually, it's so bizarre to even think in those terms. It would be like me saying, yeah, I believe in self-ownership and non-aggression and all that, and there's no such thing as authority. However, I really want a huge, powerful gang of people with guns who will implement the way I see the world and won't let anybody else implement anything different. In fact, won't even let anybody else implement something the same. I will make sure my massively powerful centralized government just protects individual rights. And I can't let anybody else have a competing agency, because even if they start out doing the right thing, they might later decide to do something wrong. So my centralized fascist, pro-freedom, non-authoritarian, and yet totally authoritarian ruling class will save the day. It's just a giant pile of contradictions. And Ayn Rand just wouldn't let it go, and couldn't let go of the authoritarian indoctrination. For as far as she got, for as many things as she figured out, and realizing collectivism is just the doom of mankind, and the concept of individual rights being supreme is the only thing that allows for civilized society. To understand all that, and in such detail and in such predictions. I mean, if you read Atlas Shrugged, which she wrote decades ago, just an amazing prediction of what was going to happen in the U.S. Down to the very propaganda they use, and the spin and the mentality and the bureaucratic machinery and everything about it was just amazing. But she couldn't let go of the security blanket of, so we need an authority that enforces what I believe. And she couldn't let go of that illusion of control and just say, I don't have control over anybody else. I'll say what I believe. If somebody attacks me or attacks somebody else, I'll try to defend them, and I have the right to do that. But I don't get to replace the free will and judgment of everybody else with my own. And that's really what it comes down to. And I don't want to get too religious or ethereal here, but it really is a matter of, when you look out at the world and you see 7 billion people, is it your goal to leave them in free will and respect their self-ownership? Or is it your goal to replace their free will and their judgment and their thought with your own? Because that's what government and authority is all about. I don't want to leave people in freedom. I don't want to let other people decide right and wrong for themselves. I want to take my moral code and smash it into everybody else's heads. Or at least, whether they agree with me or not, force them to abide by what I think they should do. And the thing is as soon as you accept that precedent, as long as you're the only one in the world who thinks that and everyone else is a passive sheep, it works. But as soon as two people think, well, I think I know what's right, and I want mine enforced on everybody. Well, great. You just guaranteed perpetual violent conflict, because you're both saying, I want to force my opinions on everybody else. And that's, that's why government ends the way it always does, because it's always about people bickering over whose value should be forced on everybody else. And it never allows the idea that I don't get to tell other people what to think. I can argue with them. I might even, on my own, use force against them. If somebody thinks they have a right to steal my car, I will use force to stop them. And, thankfully, such violent conflict, in the vast majority of cases, won't be necessary. But sometimes it will be. But there's a difference between, I may disagree with you to a point that it'll turn into violent confrontation. Like, if you think you get to steal my stuff or you think you get to attack somebody else, it may turn into a violent conflict. But that's different than saying, I have things figured out so nobody else should ever decide for themselves what's right and wrong anymore. They should just bow to a ruling class that does what I want, which is basically what Ayn Rand said. And it doesn't even matter if she was right about everything, because that is totally anti-free will and anti-judgment and anti-reason to tell other people, you don't need to decide things anymore. You don't have to reason things out. You're not even allowed to have a defense agency that does what you think is just, because we have it all figured out, so we're in charge. We get the power. We get the monopoly of government that gets to force the right thing on everybody. And so it's disappointing and frustrating to see somebody who got that much right not able to let go of that last piece, and not able to see the giant contradiction between the government she advocated and everything else she said, because they don't at all match. And so I brought that up with a million objectivists and saying, well, what if I want to do the exact same thing that your monopoly government does? What does it do to me? And almost never will they give me a direct answer, because they know if they say, well, if you do exactly what we're doing, we're going to violently shut you down. Okay. And you're pretending to be a protector. Like, you can do it and I can't, but we're all equal, right? Self-ownership, only you're allowed to do this and I'm not, because you're special and magical in your authority in government. So they don't want to admit that, yeah, they would have it shut down, but what's the other choice? The other choice is saying, you get to do that too, in which case, all right, there isn't a monopoly anymore on government and protection. It could be 1,000 different organizations in 1,000 different places doing the same thing, or doing slightly different things, or doing very different things. But, and this, I'll end with this. In this person's article, he was like, what if somebody decided to make a system of law based on, Sharia law, or however you pronounce that, or based on communism, or based on this, or based on that? We have to have it based on objectivism. And failing to notice that all of those, including the one based on objectivism, is based on the flawed notion that it's ever legitimate to make a ruling class. And so this fear, it's bizarre, this fear that, well, somebody might make a competing authority to do a bad thing, so we have to make a really, really, really big, powerful authority to do the good thing. And just let it go. You don't get to rule the world. You don't get to control the thoughts and actions of 7 billion other people. Just give up the notion that that's possible, or that it would be good even if it was possible. And there's part of it that's kind of scary, and there's part of it that's very freeing, to look out at the world of 7 billion people and say, I don't know what they all think. I don't know what they're all going to do. I can't predict it, and I can't control it, and that's fine. I don't need to control it. I don't need to magically know what everybody's going to do, and the only world in which I could is totalitarianism. And I don't need to control what everyone's going to think and what everyone's going to do, and the only world in which I could is a world of totalitarianism in which I'm emperor. I don't want to be emperor. I don't own those people. I only own me. And if Ayn Rand had ever all the way come to grips with the fact that she only owned herself, she would have fallen off of the status spectrum and turned into an anarchist. But she just so much wanted that control over others, to force them to be the way she should be, the way she thought they should be, without realizing that that very desire was, completely antithetical to everything else she figured out and everything else she said. But she just couldn't let go of that desire for control. And it's one of those things that it's weird when you do let go, when you turn into an anarchist and realize, yeah, I don't get to control the whole world, and I don't need to. And then suddenly there's this freeing thing of being at peace with that I don't have to fix the world, and it's not up to me to decide how every problem should be solved, because I'm only in charge of me. And I only have to be in charge of me, and I'm only allowed to be in charge of me. That works. But that's sort of the last step, and apparently Ayn Rand just couldn't do it in her lifetime. And so there's still objectivists pretending we need the right form of authoritarian monopoly government. And it's funny to watch them try to make up excuses to try to make that make sense when it totally doesn't. So, alrighty, that's my rant for today, beating up on objectivists.